to the Liberty Podcast with Clint Armitage. We are proclaiming liberty one show at a time, and the next one starts right now. Hey, welcome back. It's Clint Armitage with the Liberty Podcast. Okay, so we have been in a series talking about The Harbinger, which is a book by Jonathan Cahn. And I explained this in the past couple of episodes. But what we're going to be looking at is the harbingers, the actual signs that he talks about in the book. And we started by doing Harbinger number 1 last episode. And now we're on to Harbinger number 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play, this time around, I'm going to actually play an excerpt that talks about what the number 2 Harbinger is. And this actually comes from his second Harbinger book, The Harbinger 2, which actually just came out pretty recently. So I'm going to play this little audio clip, and then we'll have a commentary on it and talk about it and see I'll tell you what I found doing some research on it and kind of how I feel about it. All right, let's check it out.
The second Harbinger. The terrorist. The strike on ancient Israel was carried out by the soldiers of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were the world's first terrorists, the first to employ terror as a means to a political end. They were fierce, brutal, and merciless. They would bring terror to the people of any land they chose to invade. So it was when they invaded Israel. The second Harbinger was the sign of the terrorist. The destruction is masterminded and carried out not only by the nation's enemies, but by terrorists. And with America. The sign of the terrorist appeared on American soil on 9/11. The attack was masterminded and carried out not only by America's enemies, but specifically by terrorists. The Assyrians were the fathers of terrorism, and those who carried out the attacks of 9/11 were their spiritual children. Beyond that, the terrorists originated in the same region of the world from which the Assyrians came, the Middle East. And when the Assyrians carried out their strike against Israel, they did so by communicating with each other in Akkadian, a long-extinct Middle Eastern language. The closest language in the modern world to ancient Akkadian is Arabic, the same language spoken by the terrorists of 9/11 and by which they carried out their attack against America.
Okay, let's look at a few things here. First off, let's talk about the Assyrians. Let's look at that. Let's see, were the Assyrians actually terrorists? And obviously that term terrorist was not really a term back when the Assyrians were around. And so when he's talking about the Assyrians, he's talking about the Neo Assyrian Empire. And that was around 900 BC to about 605 BC. 911 BC, interesting. 911 BC to 605 BC. That's when they were around. Well, this particular, empire of the Neo Assyrian Empire that was speaking this language and also was supposedly the terrorists of the time. Well, the Assyrians of that time actually were pretty, their army, they were pretty strong. That was when they came to power, and they had a really strong military army. And they also utilized, they did things differently in warfare. They really were about torture. And when they conquered, they did some kind of unthinkable things, and they brought terror onto the people that they were conquering. And that was their strategy, their psychological warfare. So some of the things they did was they were pretty brutal. They would cut off legs, cut off arms, noses, tongues, ears, and they'd gouge eyes out. They would, burn small children alive. They were professional torturers. And so the brutality was pretty clear. Now, that's, I guess, how they would, or how you would characterize them as terrorists, because they brought terror to their conquered nations, or the nations they were going to conquer, or anybody else that was around. And so nobody really wanted to fight the Assyrians at that time. So yeah, we could call them terrorists. Now to the second point, the Akkadian language. So it is correct what the book reports, that the Akkadian language is an ancient extinct language, and it was used by the Assyrians at that time of the Neo Assyrian Empire, and it did go extinct near the 1st century. But what was happening during the 8th century, during that time of the Neo Assyrian Empire, that language was being used. And having a connection, though, to Arabic, yes, I guess it does. Now, it has a connection to other Semitic languages, such as Hebrew, such as Aramaic, and then Arabic is also included in that as well. So that there is a connection there. I haven't been able to find a super strong connection, but I did see the connection because it's Akkadian is, all those languages, or the Akkadian languages, the Akkadian language was part of other Semitic languages like Arabic, like Hebrew, like Aramaic. And the Aramaic language is the language that kind of took over after that. And it took over even Hebrew after a while. So that was the more dominant language that came into existence or into use after the Akkadian language kind of died out. And because the Neo Assyrian Empire kind of died out as well. So that, went with it, I guess. So on to that point, yes, there is connections with Akkadian and Arabic. Assyrians do come from that portion of the world, the Middle East, and Arabs do. Now let's take a final look, or the final point that we wanted to talk about was the actual terrorists. Now, there were 19 terrorists for the 9/11 attack. And of the 19 terrorists, we've got 15 of them were they were from Saudi Arabia, 15 of them. 2 of them was from the United Arab Emirates, and then 1 from Egypt, and then 1 from Lebanon. So there was a majority from Saudi Arabia, and the connection of them being Arabs and terrorists and connected to the Assyrians. Yeah, there's a general connection there. Again, a little bit harder to connect the Akkadian language to the Arabic language for me during the research. And again, my research is limited, so we can't go 100% on that. But the research that I did do, there was some connection, but there was also connection to other languages as well. So I could see a general connection to the Assyrians and the Arabs. And are they both terrorists? Yeah, the Assyrians were terrorists, and the specific Arabs were terrorists. Now, terrorist kind of nations are there as well in the Middle East there. And so I could see those connections. Again, they're more general connections, which is fine. I believe we can have general connections and we can have direct connections. Okay, and you know that I look for opposing views. And so during my research, I actually didn't find anyone opposing this specific harbinger number 2. Now, there was even one website that did the 9 harbingers, and they skipped number 2, which was interesting. So again, I couldn't find anybody opposing this specific harbinger or this view on that. But there's my take on it. My name is Clint Armitage. This is the Liberty Podcast, and I want you to stay safe, stay motivated, and keep seeking liberty. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Liberty Podcast with Clint Armitage. If you want to get in touch, email us at info@clintarmitage.com.